Imagine standing at the edge of a world where the maps simply end. The air is so cold it burns your lungs, and the only sound is the rhythmic crunch of your own boots on frozen pine needles. Behind you lies civilization, with its warm hearths and soft beds. Ahead of you lies a vast, unforgiving wilderness that wants to swallow you whole. To the men and women of the early American frontier, this wasn't a nightmare. It was Tuesday. They didn't just survive in these shadows, they mastered them. Tonight, we are going back to a time when your life depended not on a glowing screen, but on the sharpness of your knife and the wisdom of the forest. Before we step into the deep woods and uncover the secrets of the masters of the wild, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep these historical journeys alive, and by joining our community, you will never miss a chance to escape into the past. Now, settle in, dim the lights, and listen closely as we travel back to the untamed frontier. The wind howls through the gaps of a hand-hewn log cabin, but inside, the smell of wood smoke and dried herbs offers a fleeting sense of security. To understand the frontiersmen, you must first understand the silence. It was a silence that carried information. A snap of a twig wasn't just noise, it was a sentence, a warning, or perhaps a meal. The men who walked these lands, the long hunters and the scouts, lived by a code written in the dirt and the bark of trees. Their first and most vital skill was the art of observation. They learned to read the forest like a book, understanding that every broken leaf told a story of what had passed by just moments before. Fire was their heartbeat. In the modern world, we flick a switch and light fills the room, but on the frontier, fire was a hard-won prize. They didn't carry boxes of matches. Instead, they carried a small tin containing flint, a piece of high-carbon steel, and char cloth. The process was a ritual. They would strike the steel against the flint, sending a tiny, fragile spark onto the blackened cloth. With a gentle breath, a prayer of air, that spark would grow, eating into the fibers until it glowed red. This tiny ember was then nestled into a bird's nest of dried grass and cedar shavings. They would blow softly, steadily, until the nest burst into a golden flame. This fire was more than warmth. It was protection against the predators that circled in the dark, and it was the only thing standing between a man and the creeping lethargy of hypothermia. Water was the next great challenge. While the mountains were full of rushing streams, the frontiersmen knew that hidden within that crystal-clear beauty was the potential for a slow, agonizing death. They learned the ancient ways of the earth's own filtration. They would dig a hole in the sand a few feet from a riverbank, allowing the earth to act as a natural sieve, pulling the impurities away before the water filled the small basin they had created. They watched the animals, knowing that where the deer drank safely, the water was often pure, but they never took chances. They knew the plants that indicated clean sources and the mosses that pointed toward hidden springs beneath the limestone. As the sun dipped below the jagged horizon, the frontiersman turned his attention to shelter. He didn't need a tent or a sleeping bag. He knew how to use the geometry of the forest. A fallen hemlock could become the spine of a lean-to. He would weave branches of balsam fir together to create a waterproof thatch, layering them like shingles on a roof. For a bed, he gathered the soft tips of evergreens, piling them high to create a mattress that kept his body off the frozen ground. He knew that the earth would suck the heat right out of his bones if he lay directly upon it. This was the wisdom of the woods, not fighting nature, but working within its rigid laws. Clothing was their armor. It wasn't made of synthetic fibers, but of the very creatures they shared the woods with. Buckskin was the gold standard. When treated with the brains of the animal itself, a process that sounds strange to us today, but was chemically perfect for softening hide,
The leather became as soft as velvet and as tough as iron. It resisted the thorns of the thickets and the biting wind of the plains. They wore moccasins that allowed their feet to feel the ground, giving them a ghostly silence as they moved through the undergrowth. A man who could move without a sound was a man who stayed alive. Food on the frontier was never a guarantee, and the transition from a full belly to starvation could happen in a matter of days. The frontiersmen looked at the forest not as a scenic backdrop, but as a vast, living larder. Hunting was not a sport, it was a surgical operation. They understood the psychology of the animals they pursued. They knew that a white-tailed deer has a predictable path, moving from its bedding area to water at dawn and dusk. They learned to mask their own scent by standing in the smoke of their campfire or rubbing the needles of a hemlock tree against their buckskins. When they moved, they didn't walk with the heavy, rhythmic gait of a city dweller. They stepped with the outside of their feet first, rolling their weight silently, pausing after every few steps to become a part of the shadows. They waited for the wind to be in their face, knowing that a single shift in the breeze could carry their scent for a mile, alerting every living thing that a predator was near. When the hunt was successful, nothing was wasted. This was a sacred rule of the wild. The meat was sliced thin and hung over a low-smoke fire to create jerky, a lightweight and protein-rich fuel that could sustain a traveler for weeks. The fat was rendered down into tallow, used for waterproofing boots, greasing the mechanisms of a flintlock rifle, or making primitive candles. Even the bones were cracked open for the marrow, the most nutrient-dense part of the animal, providing the essential fats needed to survive a sub-zero winter night. This deep respect for the life taken was what separated the true frontiersman from the common wanderer. But survival wasn't just about the large kills. It was about the small, overlooked details of the landscape. They were master foragers who knew that the forest floor was covered in medicine and meals. In the early spring, they looked for the tender shoots of wild leeks or the curled heads of fiddlehead ferns. They knew that the inner bark of a white pine tree was edible and rich in vitamin C, a vital defense against scurvy when fresh fruits were a world away. They understood the power of plants. If a man cut his hand deeply with an axe, he didn't reach for a bandage, he reached for the resin of a balsam tree, a natural antiseptic and glue that would seal the wound and keep out infection. If he had a fever, he stripped the bark from a willow tree and boiled it into a bitter tea, unknowingly consuming the natural precursor to aspirin. Navigation in the deep timber was a feat of mental mapping that would baffle a modern traveler. Without a compass, they relied on the sky and the trees. They knew that while moss doesn't always grow exclusively on the north side of a tree, the bark on the north side is often thicker and more rugged due to the lack of sunlight. They watched the birds, knowing that certain species always fly toward water at sunset. At night, the stars were their map. The North Star was a fixed anchor in a spinning world, a constant friend that guided them through pathless swamps and over jagged mountain passes. They developed a sense of direction that felt like an instinct, a feeling in the gut that told them they were heading east, even when the clouds obscured the sun for days. The equipment they carried was minimal, but perfectly maintained. The flintlock rifle was their most prized possession, a heavy, long-barreled tool that required constant care. A single drop of moisture in the flash pan meant the gun wouldn't fire, leaving the man defenseless or hungry. They spent hours by the fire, cleaning the bore with bear grease and checking the sharpness of the flint. Beside the rifle sat the tomahawk and the long knife. The tomahawk was the ultimate multi-tool, capable of felling a tree, butchering an elk, or defending a home. It was balanced so perfectly that a skilled man could throw it with deadly accuracy, but more often it was used for the quiet, daily tasks of carving out a life in the wood. As winter tightened its grip, the frontiersman shifted his focus to the art of the long sleep. The cabins they built were small, not because they lacked ambition, but because a small room is easier to heat. They chinked the gaps between the logs with a mixture of mud, straw, and animal hair, creating a seal against the biting frost. They lived by the cycle of the sun, rising with the first light to maximize the few hours of warmth and retreating to the hearth as soon as the shadows lengthened. Loneliness was perhaps the greatest enemy of all. Weeks or months might pass without seeing another human face. They filled the silence with wood carving, repairing gear, and the internal storytelling that kept their minds sharp. They learned to be comfortable with their own thoughts, finding a strange, rugged peace in the isolation. Trapping was another silent language they mastered. While hunting required active pursuit, trapping was a way to hunt while they slept. They built deadfalls and snares from nothing but wood and sinew, using the tension of a bent sapling to create a hair-trigger trap for small game. They understood the paths of the beaver and the muskrat, knowing exactly where to place a set to catch the heavy pelts that were the currency of the frontier. These pelts were more than just fur. They were a ticket to the items they couldn't make themselves: lead for bullets, gunpowder, and salt. Salt was the white gold of the wilderness. Without it, meat couldn't be preserved, and the body would eventually fail. Frontiersmen would travel for days to reach salt licks, places where natural salt deposits rose to the surface. They would boil down gallons of brackish water over massive fires for hours just to get a few precious pounds of the crystals. It was a grueling, steaming, back-breaking process, but it was the difference between a winter of plenty and a winter of starvation. They carried their salt in horn containers, protecting it from the rain as if it were gunpowder itself. Beyond the physical tools and the gathering of food, the true strength of the frontiersmen lay in a psychological resilience that few in the modern world can truly grasp. It was a mental toughness born from a life where help was never coming. If you broke a leg in a ravine, you were your own surgeon. If you lost your way in a blizzard, you were your own compass. This isolation bred a specific type of character, one that was quiet, deliberate, and deeply attuned to the rhythms of the earth. They understood that the wilderness wasn't cruel, it was indifferent. It didn't care if you were hungry or cold, and that realization stripped away all ego, leaving only the raw necessity of action.
The social fabric of the frontier was woven in the rare moments when these solitary wanderers crossed paths. These meetings usually happened at trading posts or small muddy settlements at the edge of the known world. Here, information was more valuable than gold. A man might trade a bundle of beaver pelts for a few pounds of lead and powder, but the real currency was the news of the trails. Which mountain passes were blocked by snow? Which rivers had flooded their banks? What were the movements of the various indigenous tribes? This exchange of knowledge was a survival skill in itself. The frontiersmen had a complex relationship with the Native American tribes they encountered. While there was often conflict born of territorial expansion, there was also a profound, if sometimes begrudging, respect. The frontiersmen were essentially students of the indigenous way of life. They adopted the moccasin, the long-handled pipe, and the medicinal use of local roots because those things worked. They learned the names of the mountains and rivers from the people who had lived there for millennia, slowly integrating that ancient wisdom into their own survival kits. Communication on the frontier was often nonverbal. They used trail signs that would be invisible to an untrained eye. A specific arrangement of stones, a sapling bent at a sharp angle, or a notch cut into a tree bark could tell a following party exactly which direction to go or warn them of a danger ahead. These were the whispers of the woods, a silent telegraph system that spanned hundreds of miles of trackless forest. Even smoke signals, learned from observing tribal communications, were sometimes used to signal across vast valleys when time was of the essence. As the frontier pushed further west, the terrain changed, and so did the skills required to survive. The dense, humid forests of the Appalachian Mountains gave way to the rolling, tall-grass prairies and the high, arid plains. Here, the challenge wasn't just finding food, but finding cover. The lack of timber meant that fire had to be made from buffalo chips, dried animal dung that burned with a hot, steady flame but offered little light. Navigation became even more difficult on the flat horizon, where one hill looked exactly like the last for 300 miles. In this environment, the frontiersman had to become a master of the sky, reading the shapes of the clouds to predict the sudden, violent thunderstorms that could turn a dry creek bed into a raging torrent of mud and debris in minutes. The psychological toll of the plains was different from that of the forest. In the woods, a man felt enclosed, watched by the trees. On the plains, the sheer scale of the sky could induce a sense of insignificance that drove some men to madness. To counter this, they focused on the minute details. They watched the behavior of the prairie dogs and the flight patterns of the hawks. They learned to find water pockets in the shadows of rock formations where the sun couldn't reach, and they became experts at reading the heat haze on the horizon to distinguish between a distant buffalo herd and a shimmering mirage. Life was also a constant battle against the elements of the body. Insects were a relentless enemy. In the summer, swarms of mosquitoes and biting flies could drive a man or his horse to the point of exhaustion. They learned to use animal grease mixed with crushed wild mint or cedar oil as a primitive repellent, coating their skin in a thick, pungent layer that kept the worst of the horde at bay. They knew that staying near the ridges where the wind blew harder would offer some relief, while the lush, beautiful valley floors were often death traps of disease-carrying insects. Then there was the silence of the winter on the high plains. When the snow came, it didn't just fall, it was driven by winds that could strip the skin from a man's face. During these times, the frontiersmen would often hole up in a dugout, a shelter carved directly into the side of a hill or even underground. The earth served as a natural insulator, keeping the interior at a constant, if chilly, temperature, regardless of the gale outside. They lived like the bears they hunted, entering a semi-hibernation, conserving every calorie, and waiting for the first signs of the Chinook winds that promised a thaw. One of the most overlooked skills of the frontiersman was his ability to fix his own gear with almost nothing. A snapped rifle stock would be bound with wet rawhide, which tightened as it dried, creating a bond stronger than the wood itself. A torn buckskin jacket was stitched with sinew taken from the back of a deer. They were the original masters of the make-do philosophy. If they didn't have a tool, they carved it. If they didn't have a bowl, they charred out a piece of a log and scraped it clean. This self-reliance gave them a sense of freedom that no city dweller could ever know. They were beholden to no one, masters of their own destiny in a world that offered no safety nets.
As the years passed, these men became legends in their own time. Figures like Daniel Boone or Kit Carson weren't just explorers, they were icons of a specific type of human capability. But for every name recorded in history, there were thousands of unnamed frontiersmen who lived and died in the tall grass and the deep pines. Their legacy isn't found in books, but in the very trails we hike today and the survival techniques that are still taught to those who wish to reconnect with the wild. They proved that the human spirit is infinitely adaptable, capable of finding beauty and purpose in the harshest corners of the world. Even their leisure time, as rare as it was centered around the skills of survival. At rendezvous points, large gatherings where trappers and traders met once a year, they held competitions. Who could throw a tomahawk with the most precision? Who could hit a mark with a long rifle at 200 paces? Who could start a fire the fastest? These weren't just games, they were ways to sharpen the tools of their trade and to prove to their peers that they were still fit for the demanding life they had chosen. They told tall tales, yes, but within those stories were nuggets of truth about new trails, dangerous animals, and the ever-shifting borders of the wilderness. The transition from the lush eastern woodlands to the brutal high desert and the towering peaks of the Rocky Mountains marked a new chapter in the frontiersman's evolution. As they pushed further, the very nature of their reality changed. In the mountains, the air grew thin, and the winters became long, suffocating blankets of white that could last for 8 months of the year. Here, the mountain men emerged as a distinct breed. These were individuals who often went years without hearing the sound of a church bell or seeing the inside of a shop. They moved among the peaks like ghosts, draped in heavy buffalo robes and carrying everything they owned on the backs of 2 or 3 sturdy mules. To survive the high altitude, they had to master the science of the mountain. They learned that fire behaves differently in the thin air, requiring more oxygen and a different choice of wood. They learned to recognize the warning signs of an avalanche, reading the angle of a slope and the layering of the snow like a veteran sailor reads the waves of a stormy sea. They knew that a certain hollow sound beneath their snowshoes meant the snowpack was unstable, and a single wrong step could trigger a wall of ice that would bury them forever. They lived in a world of extremes, where a midday sun could be blindingly hot, reflected off the glaciers, while the night could bring temperatures that would freeze a cup of water solid in minutes. The mountain man's diet was almost entirely carnivorous. While the eastern frontiersman had access to berries and greens, the high-altitude hunter lived on what he killed. Buffalo, elk, and mountain sheep were his staples. He developed a refined palate for parts of the animal we now consider exotic. The tongue of a buffalo was a delicacy, often cured and saved for special occasions. The liver, eaten raw and warm immediately after a kill, provided the essential vitamins that were missing from a diet of cooked muscle meat. This wasn't a matter of savagery, it was a matter of biological necessity. They were eating to survive, fueling a body that was constantly burning thousands of calories just to keep warm and move through the rugged terrain. The horses and mules they kept were more than just transport. They were their most trusted companions. A frontiersman would often talk to his horse as if it were a brother, sharing his thoughts and his fears in the long, lonely stretches of the trail. The bond was one of mutual survival. He knew that the horse could sense a predator long before he could, and he watched the animal's ears with the intensity of a scholar. If the horse's ears flicked forward and its nostrils flared, the man's hand was already on his rifle. In return, he protected his animals with fierce loyalty, often going hungry himself to ensure they had a patch of grass or a bucket of water.
Their gear continued to evolve with the landscape. The long, slender Pennsylvania rifles of the East gave way to shorter, larger-bore Plains rifles or Hawken rifles. These were designed to bring down massive grizzly bears and buffalo at long distances. They were heavy, brutal tools, but in the hands of a master, they were remarkably accurate. A man's life often hung on his ability to cast his own lead bullets over a campfire, using a small brass mold to create perfect spheres that would fly true. He would carry a possibles bag slung over his shoulder, containing everything he might possibly need for a day or a week away from his main camp. Extra flints, a small knife, a sharpening stone, a bit of tow for cleaning the gun, and perhaps a small charm or a piece of jewelry from a life he had left behind. In these high places, they also encountered the great predators of the West. The grizzly bear was a force of nature that demanded a level of caution and respect that no other animal did. The frontiersmen learned never to camp near a fresh kill and to keep their food high in the trees, though trees were often scarce. They learned the body language of the bear, the difference between a curious huff and a deadly charge. To kill a grizzly was a rite of passage, a feat that required nerves of steel, as the black powder rifles of the time gave you only one shot before a long, slow reload. If that first shot didn't find the heart or the brain, the man had to rely on his knife and his courage. The sense of time on the frontier was fluid. They didn't mark days by numbers on a calendar, but by the turning of the leaves, the migration of the geese, and the changing position of the constellations. A moon was their month, and a season was their year. This slower, more natural pace of life changed their internal rhythm. They became patient. They could sit for hours, motionless, watching a beaver dam or waiting for a storm to pass.
This patience was their greatest weapon. They didn't rush into a valley. They sat on the ridge and watched it for half a day, looking for smoke, for moving animals, or for anything that looked out of place. Health and hygiene were rudimentary but practical. They used the steam from natural hot springs as a way to cleanse their skin and soothe aching muscles. They used a chew stick from a willow or birch tree to clean their teeth, and they used the ash from their fires as a primitive soap to cut through the grease and grime of the trail. While they may have looked ragged and dirty to a city dweller, they were often remarkably healthy, their immune systems hardened by constant exposure to the elements and a diet free from the processed sugars and diseases of the crowded settlements. As we look back at these men, we see a bridge between two worlds. They were the scouts of civilization, yet they often hated the very society they were paving the way for. They loved the wild for its danger and its honesty. In the woods, you couldn't lie. You were either capable or you were gone. This harsh reality created a sense of clarity that is hard to find in our modern, cluttered lives. When we listen to the wind in the trees or the crackle of a fire tonight, we are hearing the same sounds they heard. We are feeling a small part of that same ancient connection. While the history books often focus on the lone hunters and trappers, the story of the frontier would be incomplete without the courage of the women who walked these same trails. For every man who scouted a mountain pass, there was often a woman standing at the edge of a wagon or the door of a sod house, holding a family together with a strength that was both quiet and unbreakable. These women were frontiersmen in every sense of the word. They didn't just cook and sew. They were surgeons, architects, farmers, and defenders. They learned to handle a rifle with the same precision as a needle, knowing that while their husbands were away hunting or scouting, the safety of the homestead rested entirely on their shoulders. A woman on the frontier had to be a master of domestic engineering. She had to know how to turn a patch of raw earth into a garden that would sustain a family through a winter where the snow piled up to the eaves of the roof. She learned the secrets of putting up food, using salt, sugar, and vinegar to preserve the harvest in jars and crocks. She understood the chemistry of lye and fat, boiling them together in massive iron kettles to create the soap that kept disease at bay. Her day began long before the sun peeked over the horizon, starting with the ritual of the fire. She was the keeper of the hearth, the one who ensured that the embers never went out, for a cold house in the middle of a January gale was a house of death. Education on the frontier happened around the fireplace. In the absence of schoolhouses, mothers became the teachers, passing down literacy and history by the flickering light of a tallow candle. They taught their children how to read the Bible or the few precious books they had carried across the plains, but they also taught them the more vital lessons of the woods. A child on the frontier learned to identify a poisonous berry before they learned their alphabet. They learned how to stay still and silent when a predator was near, and they learned that every hand in the family, no matter how small, had a job to do. This shared labor created a bond of survival that was tighter than any modern social connection. As the scattered camps and cabins began to grow into permanent homesteads, the skills of the frontiersmen shifted toward the art of building. The construction of a log cabin was a masterpiece of primitive engineering. They didn't have nails or bolts. They had the axe and the auger. They used dovetail joints to lock the logs together, a design so stable that many of these cabins still stand today, 200 years later. They used the mud from the riverbeds mixed with dry grass to chink the logs, creating a wall that could stop a bullet and turn back the wind. Every notch and every beam was a testament to their foresight. They built for the future, even when the present was uncertain. The transition to permanent settlement brought new challenges, particularly the management of livestock. Cattle and sheep had to be protected from the wolves and mountain lions that viewed the new arrivals as an easy meal. This led to the development of the stock dog, animals bred and trained to be the eyes and ears of the rancher. These dogs were as much a part of the frontier family as the children, working through the heat and the snow to keep the herds together. The frontiersman's relationship with his dog was a partnership of shadows. They moved together, understood each other's signals, and trusted each other with their lives in the dark. But even as the fences went up and the towns began to appear, the spirit of the old wilderness remained. The frontiersman never truly lost his edge. He still carried his knife, still watched the wind, and still kept his rifle clean. He saw the coming of the telegraph and the railroad with a mixture of awe and sadness. He knew that the world was shrinking, and that the vast, silent spaces he loved were being carved into squares on a map. Yet he was the one who had made it possible. He was the one who had translated the language of the forest into a language that civilization could understand. The medicine of the settled frontier was a blend of folk wisdom and hard-won experience. Without doctors for hundreds of miles, a broken arm was set with wooden splints and rawhide wraps. A deep cough was treated with a syrup made from wild cherry bark and honey. They watched the animals to see which grasses they sought out when they were sick, and they experimented with the roots and leaves of the new land. They were the pioneers of what we now call holistic medicine, understanding that the body and the environment are inextricably linked. They knew that a healthy spirit was just as important as a healthy body, and they found that spirit in the vastness of the landscape and the simple satisfaction of a job well done.
In the final days of the true frontier, as the 19th century drew to a close, a new type of person emerged, the keeper of the stories. These were the old scouts and trappers who sat on the porches of the new general stores, telling tales to wide-eyed children who would never know the sting of a blizzard in a lean-to or the sound of a buffalo stampede. Through these stories, the skills weren't lost. They were transformed into a legacy of self-reliance and grit. They taught the next generation that no matter how much the world changed, the fundamental laws of nature remained the same. You respect the fire, you honor the water, and you never take more from the earth than you need. Today, when we sit in our climate-controlled homes and look at our screens, it is easy to feel disconnected from these rugged ancestors. But their blood still flows in our veins, and their wisdom is still written in our instincts. When you feel a sudden chill and reach for a blanket, or when you find yourself staring into the flames of a backyard fire, mesmerized by the dancing light, that is the frontiersman within you. It is a reminder that we are a species of survivors, capable of enduring the impossible and finding beauty in the most desolate places. The frontier may be gone, but the skills that kept those men and women alive are timeless. They are the skills of the human heart, courage, ingenuity, and the relentless will to keep moving forward no matter what lies over the next ridge. To truly understand the frontiersman's life, one must look at the mastery of materials that we today consider simple waste. One of the most vital yet forgotten skills was the art of the brain tan. When a deer or an elk was harvested, the frontiersman knew that the animal carried the very tool needed to preserve its own hide. Every animal, it was said, has just enough brains to tan its own skin. They would simmer the brain matter in a small amount of water until it turned into a thick, milky liquid. The raw hide, stripped of hair and flesh, was soaked in this solution, which broke down the tough fibers of the skin. After hours of stretching and pulling the leather over a smooth log or a taut rope, the result was a material as soft as a modern cotton shirt, but far more durable. To make it waterproof, they would hang the finished leather in a smokehouse. The smoke reacted with the oils in the hide,
coating the fibers in a way that allowed the leather to get wet and dry out without ever turning stiff or brittle. This was the science of the woods, a chemistry passed down through generations of trial and error. The forging of tools was another silent art. While they carried their primary blades from the settlements, the constant wear and tear of the wilderness meant they often had to become their own blacksmiths. Without a bellows or an anvil, they used the heat of a concentrated hardwood fire and a flat river stone. They learned to quench steel in animal fat to give it a temper that could hold an edge against the hardest oak. They carved their own handles from seasoned hickory, a wood that could absorb the shock of a heavy swing without shattering. They understood the grain of the wood, knowing exactly how to split a log so that the handle would be as strong as the tree itself. A man's axe was an extension of his arm, and he treated it with a reverence that bordered on the spiritual. He knew that a dull blade was more dangerous than a sharp one, as it would glance off the wood and find his leg instead. Beyond the physical tools, the frontiersmen lived in a world of deep folklore and superstition, a mental map of the supernatural that helped him make sense of the overwhelming shadows. They believed in the signs of the moon for planting and hunting. They watched the behavior of the birds, not just for food, but as omens. A bird flying into a cabin was a sign of a coming change, often a warning. They believed that certain trees, like the elder or the rowan, held protective qualities, while others were hungry and would draw lightning or bad luck. This wasn't just empty myth, it was a psychological tool that kept them alert. By looking for signs and omens, they stayed intensely focused on their environment. This heightened state of awareness meant they noticed the slight bend in a blade of grass or the strange silence of the crickets long before a human threat or a predator arrived.
The art of the long trek required a specific type of physical pacing. A frontiersman didn't run, he moved with a steady, tireless shuffle that he could maintain for 16 hours a day. He knew how to distribute the weight of his pack, the possibles bag on one side, the powder horn on the other, and the heavy bedroll across the small of his back. He learned to breathe in rhythm with his steps, a meditative practice that kept his heart rate low and his mind clear. He could travel 30 miles in a day through thick brush and still have the energy to build a fire and skin a rabbit at night. This endurance was his greatest asset, allowing him to outlast the animals he hunted and the enemies he evaded. Communication with the animal kingdom was another layer of their survival. They were masters of mimicry. They could call a turkey from a thicket using a small bone from the bird's own wing, scraping it against a piece of slate to create a perfect, high-pitched yelp. They could howl with the wolves to determine the size and location of a pack, and they could whistle like a hawk to freeze a squirrel in place for a split second, long enough to take a shot. They weren't just observers of nature, they were active participants in its chorus. This ability to blend in, to sound like the forest itself, was what allowed them to disappear when they chose to, and to strike when they needed to. The economy of the frontier was built on the barter and trade system, but it was governed by a strict code of honor. A man's word was his only contract. If a trapper promised a certain number of pelts by the spring thaw, he would deliver them, even if it meant traveling through a blizzard with a frozen foot. To break a promise was to be cast out of the thin social web of the wilderness, a sentence that was often equivalent to death. This radical honesty was a survival skill. In a world where you might need to rely on a stranger's cache of food or ammunition, trust was the only thing that kept the community from collapsing into chaos. Even the way they slept was a calculated survival move. They rarely slept in the middle of a clearing, preferring the fringe where they had cover at their back and a clear view of the approach. They slept with their feet toward the fire, knowing that as long as their feet were warm, their blood would circulate better and their boots would stay dry. Their rifle was always within a hand's reach, shielded from the dew by their own body or a piece of oiled leather.
They developed the ability to wake up instantly and fully alert at the slightest sound that didn't belong to the natural rhythm of the night. This scout sleep was a light, restorative rest that could be broken in a heartbeat. As the seasons turned, they practiced the gathering of the fats. In the autumn, they focused on hunting animals that were heavy with winter grease, bears and raccoons in particular. This rendered fat was stored in bladders or wooden troughs. It was their butter, their oil, and their fuel. It was used to preserve meat through the potting method, where cooked meat was placed in a jar and covered with a thick layer of fat that sealed out the air, allowing it to stay fresh for months without refrigeration. This was the deep knowledge of preservation that allowed them to survive the starving time of late February and March, when the game was lean and the stored grain was gone. The frontiersman's life was a constant cycle of preparation and action. There was no off time. When he wasn't hunting, he was repairing. When he wasn't repairing, he was scouting. This relentless work ethic was the only path to survival. But within that labor, there was a profound sense of pride. To look at a warm cabin, a stack of firewood, and a larder full of dried meat, and know that you created all of it from nothing but the land and your own two hands, was a feeling of power that no modern luxury can replicate. They were the architects of their own existence, carving a life out of the raw material of the world. While the mountains and the plains were the stages for many legends, the rivers of the frontier were the veins of the continent. The men who mastered the water, the flatboatmen and the river scouts, faced a different set of perils that required an entirely unique set of skills. Navigating a heavy, hand-built flatboat down the Mississippi or the Ohio was like dancing with a giant. The water was constantly shifting, hiding massive trees that had fallen and become snags or sawyers, capable of ripping the bottom out of a boat in seconds. These rivermen developed an uncanny ability to read the surface of the water. A slight ripple in a calm stretch wasn't just a wave, it was the warning sign of a hidden rock. A swirling eddy told them of a deep hole where the current might pull them off course. They lived by the rhythm of the current, traveling by day and tying up to the bank at night, always on guard against the river pirates who haunted the thickets along the shore. Water survival on the river was a constant battle against dampness. A wet frontiersman was a cold and sick frontiersman. They developed techniques for keeping their precious gunpowder dry, even if they fell into the water, using double-layered horn containers sealed with beeswax. Their clothing was often treated with a mixture of linseed oil and beeswax to create a primitive oilskin that shed the rain and the spray of the rapids. On the river, they learned the art of poling, using long, stout wooden poles to push their heavy crafts against the current, or to navigate through shallow, muddy bayous. It was back-breaking labor that built shoulders of iron and a spirit that couldn't be broken by the heat or the biting flies of the southern swamps. In the southern reaches of the frontier, the landscape changed into a labyrinth of cypress knees and dark, slow-moving water. Here, survival meant dealing with heat, humidity, and predators that were silent and submerged. The frontiersman in the swamp learned to build chickees, or elevated platforms, to keep his sleeping area away from the damp ground and the snakes. He became an expert in the use of the dugout canoe, carved from a single massive cypress log. This vessel was perfectly balanced and could glide through water so shallow it would barely wet a man's ankles. In these dark waters, they learned the value of the alligator, not just as a dangerous adversary, but as a source of tough leather and oil. They learned to move with the stillness of the heron, knowing that in the swamp, the one who makes the most noise is the one who becomes the prey. As the frontier expanded, the long hunter gave way to the surveyor. These men were the mathematicians of the wilderness. Carrying heavy chains and brass transits, they walked thousands of miles to mark the boundaries of the new world. They had to be both warriors and scholars. They would calculate the stars at night to fix their position and fight off a pack of wolves in the morning. Their journals were filled with sketches of new plants, maps of hidden valleys, and notes on the quality of the soil. They were the ones who translated the raw, wild beauty of the land into the language of ownership and law. Yet even as they drew their lines on paper, they knew that the land itself would never truly be tamed. The art of scouting was perhaps the highest form of frontier skill. A scout was more than just a guide. He was a human sensor. He could tell the difference between the smoke of a cooking fire and the smoke of a forest fire from miles away by the color and the scent. He knew that the sudden flight of a crow meant that someone or something was moving in the valley below. He practiced the ghost walk, a way of moving where the foot is placed so carefully that not a single dry leaf is crushed. He learned to freeze in place, holding a position for half an hour without blinking, becoming as invisible as a mottled tree trunk. This level of patience and physical control was what allowed them to gather intelligence and lead wagon trains safely through territory where every shadow could be an ambush.
The frontiersman's relationship with his tools reached a peak in the maintenance of his knife. To a man in the deep woods, a knife was his teeth, his claws, and his primary builder. They favored the Bowie style or the Green River knives, heavy-backed blades that could chop wood, skin a deer, or defend a life. They didn't just sharpen their knives, they honed them until they could shave the hair from their arms. They used a combination of river stones and leather strops impregnated with fine wood ash to achieve an edge that was terrifyingly sharp. They knew that a blade was only as good as its handle, often refitting their knives with antler or bone that provided a secure grip even when covered in blood or rain. Communication over long distances was achieved through a system of caches and trail markers. If a man was traveling ahead of his family, he would leave messages in a blaze, a spot where the bark was shaved off a tree. He might carve a simple arrow or a set of initials. For supplies, they would build a cache, a hidden storage pit lined with dry grass and stones, buried deep enough to hide the scent from bears, but marked with a sign that only his partner would recognize. This hidden network of supplies and information made the vast wilderness feel a little smaller, a little more connected, even when the nearest neighbor was 50 miles away. The concept of frontier justice was a survival mechanism of the social kind. In a land without judges or jails, the community, no matter how small, had to police itself. The code was simple. You don't steal a man's horse, you don't poison a well, and you don't abandon a person in need. To violate these rules was to face the slow walk, where a person was stripped of their gear and told to leave the settlement, never to return. In the wild, your reputation was your shield. A man known for his bravery and his honesty would find an open door at any cabin, while a man known for greed would find only a closed shutter and a loaded rifle. As we move deeper into the night and the fire burns lower, we realize that the frontiersman was the ultimate generalist. He wasn't just a hunter or a builder. He was a master of the entire human experience. He knew how to birth a calf, how to sing a ballad, how to track a ghost, and how to die with dignity. He was a product of a world that required everything from him, and in return, it gave him a sense of freedom that we can only dream of today. The survival skills of the frontier weren't just about staying alive. They were about living with a fierce, burning intensity that refused to be extinguished by the cold or the dark. The production of ammunition and gunpowder was perhaps the most scientific of all the frontiersmen's forgotten skills. In a world where you couldn't simply walk to a store, being able to manufacture your own means of defense was the ultimate form of independence. They would search for limestone caves where bats had lived for centuries, digging up the nitrogen-rich earth to extract saltpeter.
This was mixed with charcoal they burned themselves from specific woods like willow or alder, which produced a consistent, fast-burning coal. The final ingredient was sulfur, often traded for in large blocks and ground into a fine yellow dust. The mixing was a dangerous, delicate process, done in small batches with wooden tools to avoid any chance of a static spark. They knew that the quality of their powder determined the trajectory of their lead, and a man's life often depended on the velocity of a single shot. They would test their powder by burning a small pinch on a flat stone. If it vanished in a clean puff of white smoke without leaving a residue, it was fit for the long rifle.
Lead molding was a more common daily ritual. Beside the evening campfire, a man would melt down scraps of lead in a small iron ladle. He would use a brass or iron mold, hand-cut to the exact caliber of his specific rifle. He knew that even a hair's breadth of difference in the size of the ball could cause the gun to jam or the shot to fly wide. Once the lead was poured and cooled, he would use a small knife to trim the sprue, removing the excess metal until the ball was a perfect, smooth sphere. These balls were then wrapped in patches, small circles of linen or thin leather soaked in bear grease or saliva. The patch acted as a gasket, gripping the rifling of the barrel and spinning the ball as it exited, giving the frontiersmen the legendary accuracy that made the American long rifle the most feared weapon in the world. Among the legends of these skills, the name of Jim Bridger stands as a monument to human memory and adaptation. Bridger was a man who could look at a mountain range once and remember every creek, every pass, and every hidden valley for 50 years. He was one of the first to see the boiling geysers of what is now Yellowstone, and though people called his descriptions tall tales, he was simply describing a reality that was too vast for the civilized mind to accept. He possessed a geographic instinct that allowed him to draw maps in the dirt with a stick that were more accurate than the ones made by the government surveyors. This mental mapping was a skill born of necessity. When you are 1,000 miles from the nearest road, your mind is your only GPS. The frontiersman also had to be a master of the long-distance signal. On the high ridges of the West, they used mirrors made of polished tin or even the blade of a knife to catch the sun and flash messages to distant parties. They developed a primitive code of flashes that could communicate danger, water, or come quickly. When the sun was down, they used the owl hoot or the wolf bark, sounds that would seem natural to an outsider but carried specific meanings to their partners. This secret language of the wild was a layer of protection, a way to speak across the canyons without alerting the hostile forces that might be listening in the brush. As we look at the final days of the untamed frontier, we see a shift in the very soul of the wilderness. The great buffalo herds, once so thick they looked like a moving carpet of black wool across the plains, began to vanish. The frontiersmen saw this change first. They felt the shift in the wind, the way the silence of the prairie became more hollow and less vibrant. They were men caught between two eras. They had opened the door for the settlers, but as the fences and the telegraph lines moved in, they found themselves retreating further into the high mountains, looking for the last pockets of clean air where a man could still see 100 miles without a chimney in sight. The craft of the pack saddle was another essential but overlooked skill. A poorly loaded mule would develop sores that could cripple it in days, leaving a man stranded with hundreds of pounds of gear. They learned the diamond hitch, a complex series of rope loops that tightened under tension, ensuring that the load wouldn't shift even on the steepest mountain trails. They used pads made of sheepskin to protect the animal's back and learned to balance the weight to the ounce. This logistics management was the unsung hero of the westward expansion. Without the humble mule and the man who knew how to pack it, the mountains would have remained an impassable wall. In the winter camps, they practiced the art of the story. This wasn't just entertainment, it was a way to keep the mind sharp and the spirit high during the months of darkness. They would compete to see who could tell the most elaborate story,
often weaving in real survival advice disguised as a legend. A story about a goosed elk might actually be a lesson on how to find a hidden spring in a specific canyon. A tale about a mountain devil might be a warning about a dangerous rock face or a pack of particularly aggressive wolves. This oral tradition was the library of the frontier, a way of passing down 1,000 years of accumulated wisdom to the next generation of scouts. The final skill of the frontiersmen was the ability to fade. They knew when it was time to move on. When the smoke from a neighbor's chimney became visible, it was time to pack the mules and head further west. They were a people of the horizon, always looking for what was over the next ridge. They didn't seek to own the land, they sought to be a part of it. They lived with a leave-no-trace philosophy long before it became a modern movement. When they left a campsite, the fire was buried, the grass was brushed back up, and the only thing remaining was the memory of their presence. They moved like the wind, leaving the world exactly as they found it, but changed forever by the stories they left behind.
The sunset of the frontier was not a single moment in time, but a long, slow fading of a way of life that had defined the American spirit for generations. As the 19th century drew to a close, the wild spaces were being tamed by the iron rails of the locomotive and the copper wires of the telegraph. The men who had spent their lives talking to the wind and reading the dirt found themselves standing on the edges of towns that didn't understand the language of the wilderness. But as the physical frontier disappeared, the skills themselves didn't die. They retreated into the hearts of those who still felt the pull of the horizon. They became a legacy of self-reliance, a reminder that a human being is a creature of immense capability when stripped of the comforts of civilization. The final mastery of the frontiersmen was the preservation of the old ways in a changing world. They taught their grandchildren how to find the North Star and how to tell the difference between the track of a predator and a prey. They shared the secret of the fire starter, showing how a single spark could be coaxed into a life-saving flame. These skills became the foundation for what we now call woodsmanship or bushcraft. They are the techniques of the deep past, preserved like embers in a hearth, waiting for someone to breathe life into them once again. To learn these skills today is not just about survival, it is about reclaiming a part of our own history. It is about proving to ourselves that we are not entirely dependent on the machines we have built. In the quiet corners of the world, away from the hum of electricity and the glow of neon, the spirit of the frontiersman lives on. It is there when a hiker pauses to listen to the shift in the breeze, sensing a coming storm before the clouds appear. It is there when a camper carefully carves a spoon from a piece of fallen birch, or when a storyteller sits by a crackling fire and weaves a tale of the high peaks and the hidden valleys. The wilderness may have been mapped, but the mystery remains for anyone brave enough to step off the beaten path. The skills of the frontier are a bridge across time, connecting us to a lineage of men and women who were unafraid of the dark and the silence. As we conclude this journey into the forgotten world of the frontiersmen, we are left with a single powerful truth. Survival is as much about the mind as it is about the body. The greatest tool these pioneers carried wasn't a rifle or the knife, but the unyielding belief in their own ability to endure. They lived with a can-do spirit that turned obstacles into opportunities and fear into focus. They knew that the world is a dangerous place, but they also knew that it is a beautiful one, and that the price of freedom is often the willingness to face the unknown alone. The fire is now burning low, the embers glowing like the distant memories of the trail. The stories of the long hunters, the mountain men, the river scouts, and the homesteaders are now part of the air we breathe.
They remind us that we come from a long line of survivors, people who walked through the fire and the frost to build the world we stand on today. Their wisdom is a gift, a survival kit for the modern soul, reminding us to stay alert, to stay humble, and to always keep our eyes on the horizon. Before you drift off into a deep and restful sleep, carry with you the strength of the frontier. Know that within you lies the same grit and ingenuity that conquered the mountains and the plains. The world may change, but the stars and the trees remain, and the old ways are never truly lost as long as someone is willing to listen to the whispers of the woods. Thank you for traveling back in time with us tonight. May your dreams be filled with the scent of pine and the sight of wide open spaces. If you found peace and inspiration in these tales of the wild, please remember to subscribe to the channel and share this journey with someone who needs a moment of escape. Your presence here keeps the history of the frontier alive. Rest well now, knowing that you are part of an ancient and unbreakable story. The trail continues tomorrow, but for now, the wilderness is at rest. Sleep deeply, and let the silence of the woods be your sanctuary. Good night.
As we linger in these final moments before the fire turns to gray ash, it is worth reflecting on the physical and spiritual legacy left by those who first mapped the unknown. The frontiersman's life was defined by a series of paradoxes. He was a man who sought solitude but built the foundations of society. He was a hunter who possessed a deeper love for the animals he pursued than many who lived in the safety of the cities. He was a man of few words, yet his life told an epic story of human potential. This final chapter is a tribute to the last of the scouts, those who saw the final closing of the American wilderness and chose to remain part of the landscape rather than become part of the machine. One of the most profound skills of the aging frontiersman was his ability to listen to the earth. In his later years, a seasoned scout didn't need to see a track to know what was happening in the valley. He could feel the vibrations of a distant herd through the soles of his feet. He could smell the arrival of autumn weeks before the first leaf turned gold. This sensory expansion was the result of a lifetime spent without the distractions of artificial noise. It is a level of connection that we often lose in our modern world, but it is one that can be reclaimed. By sitting in silence, by turning off the devices that demand our attention, we can begin to tune back into the frequency of the natural world. The frontiersman also understood the concept of the long peace. This was the state of mind achieved after weeks of being alone in the deep timber. It was a clarity where fear vanished and was replaced by a calm, steady awareness. In this state, there was no past and no future, only the immediate necessity of the present moment. This is what modern psychology often calls the flow state, but for the frontiersman, it was simply life. He knew that when your mind is cluttered with worry, you make mistakes. You miss the warning sign of a loose rock or the scent of a predator. Therefore, he practiced a form of mental hygiene, clearing his thoughts with the rhythmic tasks of carving wood or walking the trail. As the physical frontier reached the Pacific Ocean, many of the old scouts became the first conservationists. They were the ones who realized that the unexhaustible resources of the West were in fact fragile. They saw the thinning of the beaver populations and the disappearance of the great forests, and they were the first to call for the protection of the wild places. They understood that man needs the wilderness, not just for its timber and its fur, but for his soul. They knew that a world entirely paved and fenced would be a world where the human spirit would eventually wither. Their final survival skill was the advocacy for the wild, ensuring that future generations would always have a place to test their mettle and find their own sense of wonder. The tools they left behind, the rusted traps found in high mountain streams, the notched trees in the deep woods of Kentucky, and the hand-carved journals tucked away in attic trunks are more than just artifacts. They are invitations. They invite us to remember that we are capable of much more than we think. We are the descendants of people who could build a home with an axe, heal a wound with a leaf, and find their way across a continent by the light of the stars. This realization is a powerful antidote to the anxieties of the modern age. If they could survive the blizzards, the hunger, and the vast, terrifying silence, then we can surely navigate the challenges of our own time. As you prepare to close your eyes and let the weight of the day fall away, imagine yourself sitting across the fire from one of these old scouts. He doesn't say much, but his presence is as steady as the mountains. He hands you a cup of cedar tea and gestures toward the vast starlit sky. He is reminding you that you are part of something much larger than your daily worries. You are part of the unfolding story of the earth itself. The wind that whispers through the pines tonight is the same wind that cooled his brow 200 years ago. The stars that watch over you are the same stars that guided him home. The journey of the frontiersman is a journey of the heart. It is the story of the restless human spirit that is always looking for the next horizon, always seeking to understand the mysteries of the world. Even as you sleep, that spirit is alive within you. It is the part of you that dreams of adventure, the part that seeks the truth, and the part that refuses to be broken by the storms of life. Let the peace of the frontier wash over you now. Let the steady rhythm of the wilderness settle your heart and calm your mind. You have traveled far tonight, from the frozen peaks of the Rockies to the sun-drenched plains and the dark, mysterious swamps. You have learned the secrets of the fire, the water, and the trail. Now it is time to rest. The frontier is quiet. The fire has faded to a soft, comforting glow. The animals are at peace in their dens, and the woods are wrapped in a blanket of silver moonlight. You are safe. You are grounded. You are home. Tonight, as you drift into the quiet darkness, remember the lessons of the masters of the wild. Stay observant, stay patient, stay resilient, and above all, keep the fire of your own spirit burning bright no matter how cold the wind might blow. The world is vast, and there is always another ridge to cross, but for tonight, your journey is complete. Sleep now in the arms of the great wilderness and wake refreshed, ready to face your own frontier with the courage of a scout and the wisdom of the woods. Good night, traveler. May your path always be clear, and may your heart always find its way home.